Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Publics at IHS. This is a platform where we invite scholars and practitioners to come and share their work. And today's talk is on the newly published volume, Platformization and Informality, Pathways of Change, Alteration, and Transformation. We are joined by the co-editors of the book, Aditi Suri and Ursula Hughes, and chapter authors Tobias Cutler, Ambika Tandon, and Ludmila Abilio. Welcome all, and we look forward to the discussion today. The session will be moderated by Aditi Suri, who is senior researcher here at IHS. Aditi researches, teaches, and does advisory work on the social and economic impact of technology in India and the Global South. So Aditi, over to you to introduce the session and the speakers today.
Thank you, Tanvi. Hi, everyone. Good evening from Bangalore and many other places that our panelists are at. Thank you for joining us today. I've been part of some of the previous publics at IHS, hosting other scholars as they share their work. So today, I'm excited and quite humbled to share some of my own work at this venue. So as Tanvi said, I have been part of a two-person team that has put together a collection of essays around digital platforms and the informal economy. The book is called Platformization and Informality. It's been published by Palgrave Macmillan, and it came out in May of this year. So it's just been a few weeks that it's been out. The book has a collection of 8 essays from scholars working in the Global South who are piecing together how differently platforms operate in economies that have a lot of informal activity. So we have contributions that cover a fairly wide geography. We have scholars writing from Mumbai, Bangalore, Jakarta, Cape Town, Sao Paulo, and other cities in the Global South. We've been quite lucky to have scholars who are writing from very diverse positions, from the International Labour Organization, Oxford Internet Institute, Trade Union Congress, Overseas Development Institute, National University of Singapore. And so the diversity of scholars also reflects that people are writing for the academy, but also writing for the policy implications of platform work in the Global South. And so insights from the book really speak to both sets of audiences. We've also been able to cover a fairly wide sector of work in the digital platform economy. So people who are working on studying taxi drivers, domestic workers, and also people who are studying online labor platforms. So what we'll do today is just have a conversation around why we have put the book together this way, and really devote a lot of attention to the 3 authors who have joined us today, Ambika Tandon, Tobias Cutler, and Ludmila Abilio. And we'll talk a little bit about why the book is framed the way it is. And I hope really as a very broad outcome of the book being published and also us having this conversation today is that these chapters start to inform who we cite and how we think about global discourse on platformization in the world, right? I hope these cases start to get used in classes around the world to teach students that technology can be talked about and defined from the Global South and not just from experiences of workers in New York and London. And so our approach to looking at the concept of platformization and informality, these are 2 fairly large words and mouthful of academic concepts that I'm throwing at you. But they really speak to how digital platforms have proliferated in specific parts of the world, right? And so we could have taken many different approaches to looking at platformization and informality, but we've chosen to really look at work, labor, and livelihoods. It's one of the most pressing concerns globally, the idea of what the future of work is, how to give workers a decent life, how to navigate policies around economic development now that digital platforms have come to occupy a fairly large and significant part of the labor market. And it's also a really great place to see just how divergent experiences in the Global North and the Global South are. And it will be evident to scholars, perhaps, who are joining us and the scholars who are on this panel, that the state of research around digital platforms and employment really takes dominant narratives for the Global North and tries to use and force fit a lot of those frames into our geographies and into the experiences of our workers. And so this book is really a small attempt to try and shift that conversation into looking at how we can start to conceptualize what's happening in our geographies. The book is also really a product of the pandemic. The issue of worker vulnerability became even starker in the pandemic. Platforms were being used as responses to lockdowns and emergency protocols. Many platform workers around the world, like in India, were essential workers. They were also platform workers were being repurposed to do a lot of the work that governments were not being able to. And I think the pandemic also showed the consumer class around the world who was able to shelter at home and who had to work, right? And so the book in itself was also conceived of in 2020 as these things were happening around us. And, and I want to also just point out that all of the authors, including the people who are joining us today, wrote through very difficult personal and professional times. And so I want to thank all of you for kind of contributing and sticking with us as it's taken some time to bring this book to life. I also want to thank Palgrave Macmillan, who has published this, and I think our publisher, Shala, will be joining us a little bit later on the conversation. This has really been a product of some very difficult years. I want to kind of pause here before making further comments, but to really start by opening up the conversation to my co-editor, Dr. Ursula Hughes, who I'll ask to take us through how this book really came to be. But what I'm taking for granted as we start this conversation, because this is an audience brought together by IIHS, is that we all have an understanding of what informal work is, what informal activity means, and how that's related to the Global South. There have been a lot of, productive and unproductive debates over the years on what these words mean, but they have been very significant also in shaping our development agendas and our growth strategies. And informality, as we've learned from decades of really excellent research, is deeply intersectional. Women and marginalized groups are far more likely around the world to be placed in informal jobs and are unable to get better quality jobs, higher incomes, better skills, and the dignity associated with the formal economy. And the fear has always been in the Global South that the platform economy will replicate some of these things. And as we start to kind of talk about these in a more abstract way, let me stop and ask Dr. Hughes, can you tell us how this book came to be and the wider series it's part of? What about this issue kind of caught your interest? And I want to give everyone listening a little bit of a background into Dr. Hughes. She's built scholarship on women's work, globalization of the economy, and social reproduction for many decades. She's currently the director of Analytica, Social and Economic Research, and the editor of work organization Labor and Globalization, which is an open access journal which publishes really widely on this issue of technology and employment. And she has until recently been professor of labor and globalization at universities in the UK. So with your experience, having done research around these issues for many decades, what do you think platformization has done to kind of add to our understanding of informality? How do you think the relationships work? And can you give us a little bit of a historical context into how these competing forces can be looked at?
Well, thank you, Aditi. First of all, big thanks to IIHS for hosting and organising this event. It's just really nice to bring people together, especially focusing on a rather under-discussed issue. To declare an interest, along with Professor Rosalind Gill from City University in London, I have the privilege of co-editing the book series in which this book sits. It's called The Dynamics of Virtual Work, and the reason it's called that is because it grew out of a cost action, which was a European-funded international research network that ran from 2012 to 2016. called The Dynamics of Virtual Work. It says quite a lot about the importance of the topic that, 10 years on, the book series is still thriving and expanding. And so it was really in the context of that research network that I started doing research on platformization around 2014, 2015. But it did, of course, build on work I'd done in the past on teleworking, offshore outsourcing, the restructuring of global value chains, and so on. It draws on quite a lot of previous research on the role of technology in the global restructuring of work. And when I started reviewing the other research that was going on in around 2015, I was very struck by two aspects of it. The first was that, of course, the research was mainly focused in Europe and the United States and other developed economies. And it focused particularly on particular kind of platform work, which was actually numerically not the largest part of platform work, but by far the most visible, and that was driving and delivery work. Driving and delivery work was, first of all, very visible because you see these guys on the streets, and most people as consumers have had direct contact with them. It also had the advantage of being rather easy to access if you were an idealistic young male PhD student who wanted to do participant observation. It was pretty easy, to sign up with Deliveroo or Uber or whoever and do some work. And other kinds of platform work, for instance, domestic work and online work, were much more hidden and were rather concealed from this field of research. And there was also a kind of, I guess, slightly triumphal kind of celebration of the ways in which these workers were organizing. And of course, historically, it's always been much easier for workers to organize if they're young and fit and male and meeting each other on the street and, have opportunities to physically get together. And there's also a long history of left-leaning researchers wanting to be part of that movement. When I was young in the 1970s, they were all going to work in auto factories too. But that's bad. So anyway, so there was this kind of focus on driving and delivery workers who were seen as potentially organizable, but they were also seen in a context of, I could crudely break down into two different kinds of economy, developed economy. And one was that countries like, Sweden, Denmark, to a lesser extent, Germany, countries in the global north in which in the 20th century there was a very, very high degree of decommodification. In other words, there was a normal, never covered all women workers, it never covered migrant workers, but it covered a big enough proportion of the working class to be seen as a norm, whereby a worker had a full-time permanent job with paid holidays, with a pension, with recognized qualifications and training. And this normative model, I think it was not just in the developed global north, because it was picked up by international organizations like the ILO and so on, as what the rest of the world could aspire to. It was like the model of development in the mid-20th century was, you do what you're told and develop your economy in this way, and you too can end up like Sweden. It was kind of very much this norm. So in the context of countries with a high level of decommodification, platform work was seen as profoundly casualizing and precarizing. And so it was seen as creating precarity. There's another kind of highly developed economy of which I say the UK and the USA are examples, where that decommodification had already been largely undone from the sort of 90s onwards through privatization and outsourcing, where you could say that the dominant model was recommodification, where instead of being seen as like a single casualizing force, platformization was seen as one kind of precarious work alongside a lot of other kinds of precarious work. But basically, in neither of those models was there any awareness that in most of the rest of the world, a very high proportion a very high proportion of the population was actually in the informal economy, whereas that commodification had never actually happened. And so there was a kind of rather crude assumption that casualization and precarization were the same thing as informalization. And informalization and precarity are seen as kind of the same thing. And when you see a global model of employment like platformization, it's kind of assumed that whatever's happening in Europe is also happening in the rest of the world in a kind of projection. And it seems to me that it's really important to unpick, to understand that informalization and precarization are two quite different things. It's possible to have a job in the informal economy which is not precarious at all, in family businesses and so on. It's equally possible for very high levels of precarity to exist in the formal sector, especially in the firms that are down at the bottom of the value chain. So that was one big lacuna. And the other lacuna, as I said, which I think is linked to it, was this refusal to look in detail at forms of platform work which were not driving and delivery work. And I think that has something of a gendered dimension to it, because in fact, there is still an informal economy in the global north, which has been ignored by researchers because it mainly involves women workers in domestic work, in babysitting, in childcare, and those kinds of things. So I was, sorry, I'm going on rather a bit, but I'm aware of these two lacunae, and in wearing my hat as editor of Work Organisation, Labour and Globalisation, about 4 years ago, I was absolutely delighted when an article was submitted by Aditi, which actually focused on work for platforms in the domestic sector in India, which raised and made visible a whole lot of these dimensions that were so missing from the dominant field of literature. And I can't remember how it happened. One thing led to another. We ended up Skyping about something or other and having such an interesting conversation and realizing how much was missing from the literature and how many misunderstandings there were about what informalization actually is, or indeed what formalization actually is, and the different dimensions of precariousness and the intersectional character of precariousness and so on, that in the course of that conversation, we kept, more and more issues kept being thrown up. And the outcome was, let's put together a book about it. And I have to say, Aditi did the lion's share of the work on assembling that book. But despite the many ups and downs of, putting it together during the pandemic, or our wonderful editor, Shala at Palgrave Macmillan, coincided with her being on maternity leave, and, all sorts of things got in the way of a smooth production process. But it's really, the book came out of that kind of intersection of interests and ideas. And I'll shut up now because I think you should hear from some of the wonderful contributors who Aditi brought together for the book.
No, thank you for that background. I think that's exactly the kind of, context we need set as we hear about some of the chapters. And so let me jump right into asking our contributors to start telling us a little bit about their chapters. But, one thing I was very mindful of, and we were very mindful of in trying to put this together. So this is a very initial kind of first step, right? We're at the point in scholarship where we still are really looking at the workers' experiences really in the context of the empirical information. And the challenge with studying the informal economy in this kind of overarching way is that there's such specificities, right? The economy in Brazil and how informality presents itself is very unique and specific to what we would have in India. And within India also, just the specificities of taxi driving in Bombay, which has a regulated taxi sector, as opposed to a Bangalore, which has no regulated taxi sector, public sector, taxis, is very specific. And so and years of scholarship have also told us that the political economy of all of these geographies, their spatial footprint, about how workers organize, where they live, how they learn about jobs, is also unique and specific. That I wanted all of our contributors first to really give us this kind of a context. Where are you writing from? Who are the workers you have spoken to? And how do we understand how unique informality is in the areas you're studying? And I think this is really helpful in understanding what it means to be an incumbent business as a platform comes to disrupt something, right? Because our understanding of how platform disruption has worked is what has happened in New York or London, but in a Bombay versus somewhere else, versus a Sao Paulo, how has the political economy of these cities really shaped how workers' experiences are? And this is a very broad, overarching question that I've shared with our contributors earlier. So I'm going to let them speak, but I'm also going to first introduce everyone properly before they start speaking. And I'm just going by the order I see everyone on my screen. So Ludmila is joining us from Brazil, where she's a sociologist specializing in labor studies. She has, for over 20 years, conducted empirical research on informal workers. And for the last many years, she's been looking specifically at motorcycle couriers in the city of Sao Paulo and how forms of labor control and management kind of intersect with the Uberization of work. Tobias is joining us from Germany, where he's, I think, now associated with the Fair Work Foundation. And I met in Bombay when he was, as a geographer and anthropologist, studying Bombay's taxi drivers. And Ambika Tandon is a senior researcher at the Center for Internet and Society, and works very, very closely at domestic workers in India. And this is a very brief introduction to your work. I want your work to speak more than my introductions for you. But if I've missed something, please do let our audience know what that is. And maybe, Ludmila, I can start by asking you to take us a little bit through the specificities of the Brazilian case and of your particular chapter.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank IGS and Aditi and Ursula for organizing this book and having us here. It's a pleasure to be here with Ambika and Tobias as well. And well, I think when we look from the South, it's always a challenge because we're talking all the time about our specificities. But actually, I think we're looking at the generalization of structural elements from the South. So they are in the center of this process of platformization. I prefer to call it Uberization. I'll explain this later. So just talking a little bit about my background, I came to this subject 10 years ago when I started to research the cosmetic resellers. So we're not talking about platforms at the time and platform work, but we had like this army of 1 million women, and this is a global phenomenon that involves the work of 160 million people around the world in the direct sales system. So this was, I think, a type of the entrancy of the platformization process. So we had already like this army of huge army of informal workers being controlled by one single company. And Then we start to talk about the informalization, not only about informal work, but it's the informalization of many elements of labor process. So I was looking at these elements. How does it work? It doesn't look like work. You are not hired. You just fill a form and then you become a consultant and you are reselling. Nobody tells you what is your working hours, where you should work, how. And this is very similar to the way platform work is functioning now. So what I mean is, when you look at this very precarious, invisible type of work, we're looking at the future of work. It seems that this is the movement we need to do all the time. And then I started to research the motorcycle riders, and it's important to emphasize that they existed long before the process of the entrance of platforms in this market. And they were very social and visible. So they were dying, they suffered many accidents in Brazil. It's our rates of accidents is something like really impressive. And they were already in the center of the distribution and circulation, not only of food, but many commodities and documents and information that needed to become material that could not only circulate online. And so they were already central workers to the city, to the circuits of the financial circuits, to real estate circuits. And they were invisible. And with the platformization, and they also, this is interesting for us to discuss because they have high rates, they faced at that time high rates of informality, but they were as well formal workers. So you have different types of contracts and they worked as formal workers. And in 5-6 years, when the platforms started to act in this sector, they changed completely. So I think when we're looking at this process, we need to think about informalization and at the same time monopolization or oligopolization that these companies play. They have this great, they are born with this goal and they achieve it. So in 5 to 6 years, they have completely changed the way these circuits operate, and even the type of things that the riders are delivering. So we have an expansion of the restaurants, of the markets, pharmacies. So many things now depend on this work. So many establishments now depend on this work. And you have the expansion of the e-commerce, which is also changing the way this work functions. And you have this centralized way of managing these workers, which we'll talk a little bit later. I don't want to talk too much. So I think these companies and these processes, they are changing so many ways of the ways the city functions, the territories organized. They have an impact in our everyday lives and an impact in the urban mobility, in the way the distribution is operating. So it's a very, very complex process that involves so many aspects. But if you look at the work of the riders, we see how it has changed so much. The way they're managed and controlled has changed so much. But at the same time, the structural elements that inform their profession, their occupation, are there. They're reproducing, but in a new way. So it's a challenge to conceptualize that and to understand how this is expanding to the north as well. Thank you, Aditi.
Thank you for that. And I think both, so Tobias, maybe you could just go next and then Ambika after that, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, well, first, thanks to Aditi and Ursula for putting this all together. I mean, this is amazing to see you all after years of working together. Thanks also, Ludmila, for this introduction. So, yeah, I mean, as Aditi said, the transport sector and also the ride-hailing sector in India is quite diverse, depending on the city where you're located. And so I don't speak for India in general, but more for my specific case of Mumbai. That's maybe the first thing that I want to say here. And yeah, I mean, as I'm exactly the type of researcher that Ursula mentioned. I'm the one researching ride-hailing workers, but I definitely would like to highlight that this is not representing the whole platform range of services. Definitely, I mean, this is a very important fact. And in the Fair Work project that I'm working in now, we really pay a lot of attention to domestic work and other kind of cloud work, as we call it. But I have actually focused on taxi services, conventional taxi services, and ride-hailing in Mumbai. And I mean, probably it's well known to the audience here, the kind of decline of formal employment relationships in Mumbai related to mill work. I just wanted to give these numbers between 1961 and 1991. There has been this huge decline of formal employment in the mill sector from 65% to 35%, and the corresponding rise of informal sector work to 65%. And this whole process of informalization has been again spurred by the economic liberalization since 1991. So I think this is one, not to make it too simple, obviously there's a huge story and it's much more than that, obviously, but just to put it in a nutshell. And of course, the transport sector has been absorbing a lot of this workforce. And I mean, in terms of geography, because Aditi, you asked for that. Of course, Mumbai has always been a place of influx from other parts of India, from northern India, Uttar Pradesh, but also from South India. Also due to the partition, many refugees ended up in Mumbai. So the taxi sector has always been a sector, and the rickshaw sector as well, of course, absorbing that workforce. So that it came that as Tarini Bedi, some of you may know her work, which is like fascinating. It has been a huge inspiration for my work as well. She has focused and researched the kind of communities that have been very dominant in the conventional taxi sector, like the Jilya Muslims from Gujarat, or also in communities from Muslim communities from Uttar Pradesh and others. So this status as a migrant city of Mumbai, I mean, this is just one aspect of the way how speciality and geography plays into that. I mean, the way the platform, the conventional taxi sector worked before platforms arrived, it usually has been a kind of driver-owner relationship. Either you, as a conventional taxi driver, you owned your vehicle or also drove it, or you rented a vehicle from an owner that had several vehicles, and usually the work and the service was centered around a taxi stand that is located in neighborhoods or at a suburban train station. So that pretty much shaped the everyday experience of conventional taxi drivers earlier, and that's how it emerged from into. I mean, that was the status. That's not entirely correct, because fleet taxis have been available before the platform taxis that we know today have entered the market. Those who are based in India know. It has been the kind of radio taxi that has been there earlier. So it has already been shifting to different, has been diversifying also earlier. So, but today you can really see that the platform sector has taken over a lot of the taxi services in India. Just to give you a couple of numbers newer numbers also that I found. So I remember that around 2014 there were like I think there were more than 60,000, even 70, 80,000 conventional taxis in Mumbai, and post-COVID, there's the number is about 20,000 only. And correspondingly, the rise of platform-mediated taxis has been rising to 75,000 and probably even more. So you see the decline in one sector and the steep rise in others. And also, I mean, as you know, also rickshaws are applying on the platforms now. There have been new services like bike taxis that have not been common to India before platforms arrived. They are very common in Southeast Asia, of course, but India has not seen these kinds of services. So there has been a whole shift in the transport landscape in terms of services. So for the moment, I would leave it with that and get into more details. Thanks.
Thank you. I think already we're starting to see just how deeply embedded all of these sectors are before the kind of platform arrives. And I think Ambika will tell us a similar story.
Yeah, thanks so much to Aditi and Ursula. And I think I'll focus a bit more on domestic and care work, since Tobias has already spoken about the context in taxi and ride-hailing. And to also say that the research that we present in this chapter is pulling on work that we did at the Center for Internet and Society over the last 5 years or so across sectors, cities, models of platformization. So it's using different methodologies. It's not one study per se, but just it's pulling on a body of work that we did at the center over the past couple of years. And I think that what we found in across our work was that precisely this kind of differences across the sectors that we're looking at within the informal economy, and how those have extremely different organization of work, type of workers that are dominant in those sectors, and also employment relations, and then how you see platforms actually entering those sectors or quote unquote disrupting them in any manner, if they do actually disrupt sectors, is completely contingent on the history of the sector rather than the kind of model of platforms that have become dominant in other spaces. So I think what I'll try to kind of say through the course of what we can try to point out through the chapter is that platforms aren't actually doing anything that's disruptive or new, and there is a lot of informality that existed in these sectors before, and they replicate that with domestic work in particular. And so in India, as well as in several other economies, domestic work is highly informal. It is mostly performed by women workers from low-income, caste-oppressed communities. A lot of them are migrant workers. And there is this occupational segregation that exists even within the tasks that workers are performing. And that is also shaped by a caste hierarchy almost, where you have workers who are placed in slightly better paid cooking jobs versus lower paid cleaning jobs. And we'll get to that slightly later, but this continues even within the platform economy. And with regards to how workers are being placed or finding this work, I think domestic work is interesting because it has always had a very heavy presence of intermediaries. And of course, workers are finding work through word of mouth as well. And that continues to remain one of the predominant models of or ways of finding work. But there has been a presence of placement agencies that are playing a very active role in bringing workers from rural geographies and then placing them into work in cities, and they are highly active in providing them a space in which to stay, for example, when they don't have that infrastructure or networks to fall back on when they migrate, and then they place them into work and take a large cut from the employers, and that could often be deducted from the workers' salaries. And their models of work are one, completely unregulated, despite a lot of calls from unions and civil society to regulate these intermediaries, and therefore also highly exploitative. So there have been a lot of instances where intermediaries have been involved in cases of trafficking, for example, and platforms, in a sense, are also trying to differentiate themselves from these intermediaries and saying that we are bringing some level of, if not formalization, some level of visibility to this work in a way that is completely different from existing intermediaries. And the other thing that's really important to note with domestic work in the cities that we were looking at was that it is, of course, highly effective labor, and that also reflects in the employment relationship, where in most jobs, in most tasks, it is a regular long-term personal relationship that exists between the worker and the employer. And to some extent, workers also expect some benefits from that very personal employment relationship, but of course comes with its own kind of caste and class related hierarchies, etc. And that also makes it a slightly more difficult sector to platformize in a typical sense, where you would understand platforms to be the kind of on-demand model. When we started doing this research back in 2018, and we're now in 2023, I think the kind of broader point remains the same, where we have, like Tobias was saying, we have in ride-hailing, delivery, these models. There is that Uberization, or that Uber typical kind of platform model that you would imagine has grown in these sectors, but it's been particularly difficult despite there being a lot of attempts by various different companies to platformize domestic work in the country because of several reasons around the type of work, the employment relations, barriers to digital access as well, of course, among workers, and the expectation of customers as well to, with the risk associated to finding regular workers on platforms, for example. Yeah, that's I'll stop there so we can get into some of the more chunky bits.
No, thank you. And I think you've started to kind of bring us to the next point, which I thought we could all kind of spend a little bit of time thinking then now in the context where in all of these, 3 cities, 3 cases of work and 3 different geographies, there is a history, there's a established political economy of how this work works. There's an established customer base in a sense. So there isn't necessarily a new market necessarily that the platform might be opening up, but it does do something to alter how the incumbent industry is working and how workers' lives are also then experiencing this kind of work, right? Because the structural relationship is fairly unique. So Ludmila, can you actually start us off, and maybe we can go in the same order if that's okay with everyone, that what is the platform then doing to Sao Paulo's career delivery people, and how do we kind of see what Sao Paulo specifically does to shape what we think about platforms?
Yes, I think what all the researchers, serious research that have been done with the motorcycle riders point is the worsening of the conditions of work. So, and through the pandemics, this was like a very serious aspect because we had like this social isolation going on, and you have like the demand for the work of the workers was really high, but their earnings were going down. So it was like really a challenge to explain how this was happening, because they were the most important workers to guarantee that we were isolated, but at the same time their conditions of work was worsening during the pandemics, which is different from the Uber drivers that they had to face like they didn't have work during, like in a city of São Paulo, when people could isolate, they didn't have work. It was the opposite with the motorcycle riders, and this, we call them here moto boys and bike boys. So the motorcycle, which is it comes from the term of office boy. So the moto boys, we call them like this since the 90s. And then with the platform works, there's this new figure which is called bike boy, because we didn't have this, the cyclists, we didn't have this in the city of São Paulo in this organized way. It was really dispersed, and now it's like, it's an army of bike boys controlled by 3-4 companies. So the first aspect is that they are working more and earning less, and they are less and less protected. So they don't have any rights or guarantees related to their work. They didn't, before as I told you before, if they were informal before, they didn't have it as well. But if they were formally hired, they had access to some protection and some guarantees related to their work. So what our research show here is that they are working like 6 to 7 days per week, more than 12 hours per day, and they are earning like around 2 to 2.5 minimum wages, and the minimum wage in Brazil is really low. So they are working a lot, and they are seeing the decreasing of their working hours value there's a decrease. So the rate of traffic accidents with fatalities or injuries related to motorcycles and bicycles is growing very significantly. So this is another aspect. They are dying more, they are getting more injured. It's a very complicated situation. And what we see in this process is that they are bearing more risks and more costs related to their activities. And there's this new aspect, I think, that they become responsible for part of the management of their work. So I like to call this a subordinated self-management, because you define how many hours you work per day, where, but at the same time you define this in a relation with rules that you cannot negotiate, or they're not even clear. So, and this is how work is being organized through the city, in this relationship between self-management and algorithmic management. So these guys are being distributed around the city in a kind of, I wouldn't say negotiation, because they don't have any freedom to negotiate, but in a kind of dialogue with, it's not dialogue as well, I don't know which word we should use, but in a kind of relation with how these rules are established. So they are trying to guess this rule all the time, and these results in the way the work is distributed around the city and in the territory. And these workers, they're mainly Black, they're mainly men. We have the participation of women is growing, And I think we have to look at motorcycles and bicycles, because the social profile is different. It's not the same. So the bike boys, they are black and they are younger. So it's like the way they find to enter the labor market. And now you have like established a type of career. So we started as a bike boy, but your dream is to become a motor boy. This is this is a new thing. And the bike boys, they are mainly black, and they work more than they work the same of the motor boys, but they earn less. And the motor boys and the bike boys, they live mainly in the outskirts of the city, but they work in the center. So you don't really have this type of work happening in a significantly way in the outskirts of the city. They are mainly based in the center. And when you look at the bike boys, it's really interesting to see their strategies, because the outskirts of São Paulo, they are really far from the center. So these guys are renting bikes, they are taking the train, the tube, the bus, and they are renting bikes in the center. Sometimes they're sleeping in the center in order to save money and to work during the best hours where they earn more. And now we have also the motor boys. This is new in Brazil. They also can rent. Instead of having their own motorcycles, they can rent. And my hypothesis is that this is going to also change the profile of the motor boys, because now it's easier for you to access this instrument of work. So in a nutshell, we can say we're seeing a type of precarization of a very precarious work, and it's changing the way it functions, its logics, the strategies that it involves. They are changing, and as I said before, at the same time, they are the same. So that's it.
Thank you for that. I think one thing that we might find common across many workers' experiences is that I think the terms of work always seemed quite hidden when we think about the informal economy, but actually the opacity with algorithmic management and with platforms is actually so much higher that in the informal economy, the rules of the game are known by people who are playing it and who are part of that labor market. They aren't as opaque as they might be to other people sitting outside. But for here, that's opaque to many, many different types of people. I think that's one thing we can really pull out when looking at these two concepts. So in the interest of time, I know we have 5 minutes left, maybe I can ask Ambika first and then Tobias to respond to that question as to, what has the platform really done analytically to challenge the way that the work was happening in the informal sector before, and how does that kind of speak to the workers' experience? And we do have about 5 to 10 minutes left on the webinar, so maybe we can just be a little faster about these responses. Sorry, we're running out of time.
I'm happy to go first, but I think, Tobias, did you have to leave soon?
Yeah, but please go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just thought I'd check in. Yeah, I think we're really getting to the crux of what we find with domestic work and how we kind of contrast that to other sectors as well. For example, what's happening in ride-hailing. So across, I think, both sectors, so I was talking about the existence of intermediaries in domestic work, and we find there that platforms have entered as one of many intermediaries that are present, that continue to be present in the sector. And in a way, when you really look at the kind of models that that are actually flourishing more, which is digital placement agencies, that's actually just old wine in a new bottle, right? So they are performing the same functions that placement agencies would, including training workers, connecting them to customers or employers, and then charging a fees for these work opportunities, and in some cases determining the terms of engagement, but in other cases not even doing that. And like I said, there is a history of exploitative intermediaries in the sector that these platforms are actually promising to eliminate. And in some cases, we find actually that platforms have just become another layer of intermediaries. So it's not even about being placed adjacent intermediaries. They are working through several intermediaries, and it might even be, for example, placement agencies that are registering workers on platforms and therefore finding work. And we actually found that quite a bit when we started to speak to workers. And so it's not even about platforms replacing existing intermediaries. They're simply just another intermediary in a layer. And that is also true for the taxi sector, where we have a lot of third-party agencies, fleet owners that are big actors in that sector as well. And that focus more on, so platforms end up focusing on lead generation, matching, rather than actually having a strong base among workers. And so, for example, we found instances of workers who actually had no idea that they were registered on platforms, because they had come in touch with another intermediary or placement agency in the past, who were the people who actually got in touch with the platform. And what that also means is that for a lot of workers, there is no material change in the way that they are finding work or their terms of engagement or conditions of work. This actually makes no experiential difference to workers as well, because a lot of platforms had physical recruitment strategies, for example, where people were going and physically taking workers' details and databasing them and then putting them on the platform, which meant for a lot of workers that they just knew of platforms as human recruiters who came to them and asked them for their information and then promised them a job. That might be the only experience that they have of a platform. And this is, of course, quite different to the everyday material kind of way in which workers in on-demand sectors experience platform work. But there as well, we find that there has been a deterioration, there has been a worsening of conditions. So we find that a lot of workers we spoke to had a lot of excitement in the early days. They told their families back in their villages to send more workers to work on platforms because of the earning opportunity. And then they were kind of drawn in with this promise of working as partners and not drivers, and the social value that came to be attached to being partners. I'll just take a minute to conclude. Yeah, I think that we are precisely getting to this unknowability or this opaqueness of platforms. So you see that across, no matter which sector it may be, with domestic work in ride-hailing, there is this kind of opacity when it comes to the actual system, the technical system of the platform, and with all of these aspects of algorithmic management, where even with these workers who are digitally, they are literate, they are kind of very working with smartphones on a daily basis, but that actually doesn't help at all in understanding how their work is actually being shaped by platforms.
Thank you. And I'm sorry for rushing anyone. And Ambika, sorry for rushing you also. But Tobias, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this from the Bombay case, because it's such a especially embedded sector of work. It's had such a strong political history. The platform story in Bombay has been quite unique. So what about the facets of informality, the social space, the spatiality of it, or other parts of it have been kind of affected?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is difficult to put in a nutshell, but I have been focusing really on the lived experience of drivers and their practices. And I've been specifically looking at this comparison also. How did it work for conventional drivers, taxi drivers, and how does it still work? I mean, it's still there, no? The Kali Peli, they're iconic. And for platform workers, and maybe I'll jump on that on that question of the esteem of the work and also the reputation, because Ambika was also mentioning when talking to the relatives at home. And I think this is a really interesting case when you compare it to the conventional taxi drivers in Mumbai and the prestige and the reputation of the driving work that the Kalipeli driver had earlier, and how Kalipeli drivers enjoyed it when they started in the 1970s and 80s. They really had this strong connection to the driving occupation, to their vehicles, because it was also the symbolic for the socioeconomic uplift of their families, and it was associated with a better future and also with the future prospects of their children. If you ask platform workers now, this enthusiasm is completely absent when I interviewed them. Even those who were initially attracted to the platforms and had this were attracted by this kind of progressive appeal, or maybe also global appeal of the platforms, they were completely disenchanted. So platform drivers really perceived their occupation solely as a way of earning a livelihood without attaching further sentiments to it. And that is really very different to the more conventional taxi driver. But I think also this kind of uncertainty that the platform driver experiences because of that black box of the platform. I think things have also changed. I mean, my fieldwork has been mostly pre-pandemic, so things also changed in Mumbai. For example, I think that the driver now is informed about the destination of the passenger. That has not been the case earlier, but this information asymmetry that has been at that point, that was really strong, and that shaped not only this kind of power relation between the firm and the driver, but really this kind of black box and asymmetry structured the working day of the worker significantly. I mean, another really important aspect is the issue of collectivization and tactics of resistance. I mean, this kind of individualized work experiences and that is experienced in platform driving work is really very dominant. That kind of collectivization that we see now in the Indian taxi sector, that has only more recently picked up pace. So the first major strike, as I remember, in Mumbai was 2018, and there's a whole story around it. But we cannot go into detail there. But otherwise, this form of collectivization among ride-hailing workers is really something that has been scarce for quite a while. So the more everyday practices of drivers to somehow find a way to rework platform work, make it more bearable, so to say, such as canceling rides, do street hailing, do hailing off the platform that is not mediated via the platform, multi-apping also. These can all be interpreted as tactics to create higher autonomy, but also making work a bit more bearable. So I think that this needs to be looked at also in terms of informality and also kind of the ethics behind certain tactics, because when you think about them from a passenger perspective, and the outcry has really been large, especially when in terms of this cancellation of rights and everything, you can really think about the ethics of that and how in terms of, or in light of this kind of overarching platform power, whether these should not, I mean, definitely, I would say these kinds of tactics are ethical tactics to work against this kind of power where no other form is actually there. And just as a last point, I would say what is interesting in the Mumbai case, that the whole sociality around the taxi driving has also changed a lot. I mean, in conventional taxi driving, the whole sociality has been centering around the taxi stand, obviously around colleagues at the taxi stand, but also with the passenger themselves. I mean, there has been a more regular and familiar relationship with the taxi drivers. This is not there, obviously, in platform driving, but forms of sociality have also changed. I mean, it's more based on digital means now. You see drivers are constantly in this kind of interaction with other drivers on the phones, with their families at home. So it has shifted. It has not vanished, but forms of sociality have definitely shifted. So that's quite interesting. But that's really just in a nutshell here. Yeah, I'll leave it with that.
That was really. I think you brought out a lot of different categories. I know we have a comment here also in the Q&A box that's thanking you for the different categories you've used, because I think it's helped bringing out analytically what the challenges are. So I mean, I think, as I said in the beginning, we were left too often thinking about what precarity meant when it came to platform work, and often it just meant not having the formal job or having social security. But the nature of change and the way in which the platform has upended how people understand the economy around them, how they're able to save, how they're able to relate to people around them, is really coming out quite a lot in the kind of comments and descriptions you've shared in your work and in this webinar. We're 8 minutes over, and Tobias has to leave in another 2 minutes. So I'm going to actually kind of pause our conversation here. I did have another last question for the authors, but I think what would be great is if everyone, you can have a look at the book and the different chapters that everyone's written, to kind of hear a little bit more about the theoretical implications of writing from the Global South about platforms. But Dr. Hughes, maybe I can ask you to just step in, maybe say some final words, and maybe incorporate some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat box, if that's okay.
Well, a lot of really interesting questions have been raised, including that very important question about the financial aspects of this. We can see platforms as like a form of rentier capitalism, if you like, which is taking this huge rent both from the customers and the workers globally, and creating a value which is not necessarily accruing in the same cities as where that value is being created. That's another question. I think that lots and lots of questions. I don't want to go into them, but there's just one which I think is quite interesting, which last time I spoke to Ludmila, which we discussed a little bit, which is when you look at what platform workers themselves are demanding, they rather rarely seem to be demanding what the policymakers would like them to be demanding, which the policy making solution seems to be, let's go back to the mid-20th century normative model of work, or of the ILO decent work indicators, which are, I know, very much discussed in Indonesia, for example. And workers actually seem to be quite ambivalent about demanding those things, and this is often written off as like a kind of false consciousness or something like that. And it seems to me that we need to go much more deeply into the ambiguities of what formalization actually would mean, particularly for women workers, for workers of low caste, for migrant workers who don't perhaps have proper citizenship status and so on. And it seems to me there's a lot of research questions to be asked, which at the moment, researchers really haven't even scratched the surface of. So what I would like to conclude is asking all of you to keep doing research, keep thinking about these questions. And if you've got an article, please submit it to Work Organization, Labour and Globalization, and we would love to publish it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Tobias had to leave, but this is, like I said, just an initial conversation just to open up the idea of thinking a little bit beyond the global north and looking at what platform workers' challenges are and how to regulate them. And thank you to everyone who's joined us and stayed on. Sorry for keeping you late. Thank you to all of the authors and contributors who joined us and shared their work. And I hope this book can have a long history. Thank you, everyone.